Hello, AP US History. Today we are going to learn about Chapter 4, Imperial Wars and Colonial Protests. So we're going to start by talking about how during this time, yes, the 13 British colonies were part of the British Empire, but the attitude that the British Crown took towards those colonies was very loose. It was not as rigid as the Spanish were with Latin America. They had this thing called salutary neglect, one of your vocab words. And it basically means the British did not strictly enforce the Navigation Acts. They had a very hands-off approach. So salutary neglect basically means hands-off, which means as long as you guys are continuing to pay your taxes, continuing to give us gold through mercantilism, and kind of don't cause any problems and just be loyal subjects, you guys could pretty much do whatever you guys want. So yes, we do have the Navigation Acts, which is another one of your vocab words, which basically means you could only trade with Britain colonies. You can't trade with anybody else. You could, as long as you keep doing that and don't cause any problems, we have salutary neglect. Again, salutary neglect means hands off, a very loose control over the colony. So they pretty much could do whatever they wanted. Many colonies saw each other as foreigners. So even though they were all colonies in the Americas, they were not really that close to each other, meaning that they didn't interact, they didn't have a lot in common. The lack of a permanent colonial unity prevented it from uniting together. This is soon going to change, and we're going to learn why. We have the Albany Congress, which the purpose of it was to form peace with treaty with the Iroquois. So if you guys remember, the Iroquois are a group of a Native American tribe that is closely up in the New England territories by New York. That's why it's called the Albany Congress. We already were having a lot of troubles with Native Americans over land, and we knew that the Native Americans had a better relationship with the French, because remember, the French treated them better because they actually respected their culture. We knew that that was going to be a problem if we wanted to get more land. So the Albany Congress tried to create peace with the Iroquois, the tribe in the upper New England colonies, so that they wouldn't side with the French in all these wars that we're having. We have the Albany Plan of Union, and it was the first form of colonial government. It was rejected by the colonists and the British because it feared the taxes and too much power were given to the colonies. So they created this plan of unity between the colonies, and the British were like, "You guys can't do that. You guys belong to us." They feared that if the colonies were able to tax, that would give too much power to something that we control, the British. So they rejected this Albany Plan. So we start seeing the disconnection between the colonies and the upset with the British Empire. This is where it was proposed. The Albany Plan was proposed by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and they created this slogan basically saying "Join or Die," aimed this political cartoon over here, aimed at the colonies, basically saying if we don't unite together, we're all gonna die individually. So to trying to connect this unity between the colonies through the Albany Plan. We have the struggles for the continent. Remember, even though we have the 13 colonies that were established, there was still a lot of land. There was still a lot of conflict with the Native Americans and competition with other European powers like the Spanish and the French. So the French and the English competed for Native American loyalties. Remember, the English did not treat the Native Americans that well. That's why we were trying to get in better footing with the Iroquois. The France had a more tolerant approach than the English had, a tolerant approach to the natives. That's why they liked them better. But the English did have more goods. So the Native Americans, sometimes they did side with the English, like the Iroquois, because they did have more goods. But they still liked the French better. Because of all these battles, all this competition for land, we eventually got led into a competition for that land. Any colonial war is mostly always has to do with land. So remember that. One of the most famous battles or famous wars for land was called the French and Indian War. Only in America, it's called the French and Indian War. Everywhere else in the world, it is known as the 7 Year War. So if you go to England and they tell you, the 7 Year War, they're talking about the French and Indian War. It's the same thing. We just know it as the French and Indian War because that's the people who were fighting. So what happened in the French and Indian War? The colonists, the 13 colonies, and the British, because we belong to the British, we fought the French and the Native Americans, the Indians, in a battle for territory of the northern New England kind of area colonies, territory. So we fought for land. During and after the war, the colonists did not feel respected from the British. So even though we were working together because the colonies and the British were working together, they did not feel the respect that they needed from the British. They were just pretty much like their lackeys. During this time, we have a young George Washington. He's 22 years old and he's the youngest general in the Continental Congress. Even though he was better suited than many of the British generals, he was never able to raise in rank because he was an American. He was not natively born. He was not a native British. So that lack of promotion, lack of respect caused a lot of resentment towards the British by the colonists. We have the Peace of Paris in 1763, which eventually removed France as an essential part from the North American territory. So after the French and Indian War, France was pretty much irrelevant in North America. And what the results of the French and Indian War, very, very important, was that it left Britain in debt. If you ever get asked a question about the French and Indian War or the 7-Year War, just know that it left Britain in debt and need for money. It was costly to fight this war. It cost the British a lot of money. We have new imperialism, so new form of control over the colonies. We had salutary neglect, but after the war, the 7-Year War, the French and Indian War, 1763, that ended salutary neglect, because that basically meant the British were like, no, we can't let you guys do whatever you guys want. That's causing too much problems with the natives. We're getting into all these wars. It's becoming too expensive. No, we're going to end salutary neglect, and we're going to have more hands-on on the colonies. The British said this. So the British began to tax the colonists because they were losing a lot of money, so they decided to tax them to recover some of that money that they lost. A new prime minister, one of the people in Britain, felt that the colonists should help pay for the cost of war. And it makes sense to them because, hey, British fought this war to protect the colonists. It only makes sense for them to pay for it. They benefited from the war, so they needed to pay for it. And this was the attitude of the prime minister of Britain. Right immediately adding to the pressure, adding to the stress, we have the Pontiac Rebellion of 1763. But this was basically, it was after the 7-Year War, and it was another rebellion by the Native Americans, which again cost more money towards the British government because they had to protect the colonies. They had to send people to protect the colonists. It was another conflict with the natives in a northern territory. This led to the Proclamation Act of 1763. The Proclamation Act of 1763 was a big, big deal, a stepping stone towards the American Revolution. It basically stated, see if I have one. It basically forbade colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. What that basically means is we are having way too many problems with the Native Americans. You guys cannot expand past this point, past the Appalachian Mountains, because we don't want to keep fighting these wars with the natives for land. So you know what? You're just going to have to stay in the 13 colonies. You can't expand. You can't get bigger. You can't make more money and get more land. I'm sorry. It's just causing way too much to have you guys, to protect you guys. This did not go over well for a lot of colonists because remember, a lot of them were making a lot of money because of tobacco. But if you remember, tobacco exhausted the land, which means that after you harvest it, the land is pretty much useless. So therefore, you need to move to other lands. And if you're not able to get other lands because of the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade you from expanding, getting bigger, this was going to limit their ability to make money. This is another thing where they're being more hands-on, the end of salutary neglect, and it's affecting the colonists in a negative way. We're starting to get upset with the British. We have colonial rebellions. We finally have, you know what, this is way too much. We're going to rebel. Another part of the taxes that the British tried to put on the colonists was the Sugar Act of 1764. It was a tax on sugar to reduce illegal trade or smuggling. Remember, through the Navigation Acts, you could only trade with Britain, but that doesn't mean that we only want British good. Maybe I want to buy some stuff from France or Germany or other countries. So a lot of smuggling happened, and the Sugar Act was meant to stop this smuggling. This does not go over well for the colonists. The Vice Admiral Courts try smugglers. So Vice Admiral Courts are British courts that basically, if you are caught of being a smuggler, smuggling sugar from France, you are put to trial. There's no jury. You are found guilty automatically, and it is your job to be proven innocent. So remember that idea of innocent until proven guilty? No, that was not the case for the British. The British were like, no, you're guilty. You have to prove that you're innocent. Again, harming the colonists, and they did not like this. We have the Currency Act of 1764, where colonists could no longer use paper money. This was a big deal. Remember, mercantilism means all the money that we get from the New World, we're sending it back to the mother country. But so that means that there's not a lot of gold and silver in the New World. That's a problem because now that we can no longer use paper money, which is what the colonists were using, that means that there's not enough money to go around, causing a mini recession, harming the colonists. So this is again the British looking out for their own self-interest and not the colonists. We have the Stamp Act of 1765. It was the first direct tax. What do I mean by direct tax? Is when you guys buy a bag of chips, it costs probably like 109, 120, something like that. Those, if the bag of chips is $1, but those 20 cents that you pay, the $1.20, that 20 cents is a direct tax. You pay it directly. That's a direct tax that you pay. It was a tax on paper documents. Anything that was printed, like playing cards, anything that was printed, you needed to have a special stamp by the British, and you have to pay for that stamp. The colonists were hella upset about this. They were so upset that because it was passed without their consent. So the British just pretty much put this tax and nobody had a say in it. It was called taxation without representation. And we were hella upset about this. Nobody likes to pay taxes. So the Stamp Act Congress was created. They were so upset that they created a Stamp Act Congress, and it was the first attempt at colonial unity against the British. Remember, we're all separate. We're all kind of like our own little thing, our own little place. But because we were so upset about the Stamp Act and that direct tax, it was the first time we came together to repeal that tax, and it worked. Patrick Henry and the Virginia Resolves. He believed that the Americans had the same rights as the English and should only pay taxes passed by colonial government. So all these taxes that the British are trying to impose, that's not right, according to Patrick Henry. We have the same. We're equal to the British. We should not be paying more without having actual say in the government, which at this point the colonists did not. We have the rise of the Sons of Liberty, which terrorized stamp collectors. And the picture right before. This picture is an image of tax collector being tarred and feathered, being force-fed tea by the colonists because they were upset because they were being taxed. Sons of Liberty terrorized those stamp collectors. We have the Declaratory Act. It was passed after the repeal of the Stamp Act. Remember, the Stamp Act, Congress repealed the Stamp Act because they were so upset about it. In order to save face, Parliament passed new laws, kind of basically saying, all right, we're going to remove the Stamp Act because you guys were hella upset about it. But from now on, Parliament, the British, could pass any law whatsoever, and you guys can't say anything about it. This was the Declaratory Act. We have Charles Townshend. He was a British general, this guy right here in the corner. He wanted to increase British revenue, so what he did is he passed the Townshend Acts. Those were the trigger point for the steps towards the American Revolution. He's very important. Make sure you know who Charles Townshend is and the Townshend Acts. One of the things that he proposed was a Quartering Act of 1765, where colonists must provide quarters and supplies for the British troops. That's why we have the Third Amendment. We are not forced to house soldiers. That's pretty much their own thing. The Quartering Act basically means whoever the king sends, all those soldiers, we need to house them in our house so that they save money in hotels and stuff. We have the New York Assembly. New York Assembly was dissolved for not complying. Again, more end of sanitary neglect. We have non-importation agreements. We have the boycott of British goods. We have the growth of the American making their own goods, start growing of American manufacturing. This is when we start seeing America's kind of American-made products. No longer is everything brought from the British because we're mad at them, remember? We have the Boston Massacre of 1770, where a conflict between the colonists and the Redcoats led to 5 colonists being killed. And this was used as propaganda by the Sons of Liberty to make the British look bad. And the political cartoon reflects that. It was 5 colonists were shot in this confrontation, and it made the British look very bad. They're killing their own people. We have Samuel Adams calling for a revolution. Samuel Adams was a founding fathers and part of the Sons of Liberty. We have the Americans believe that no taxation without representation. That should sound familiar. The British East Indian Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. So we have the tea issue. That's a big thing. The British had this East Indian Company where it was basically they sold tea. And they were on the verge of being bankrupt. So what happened in the Tea Act of 1773 was that they lowered the cost of tea, but it was designed to bail out the British East Indian Company. In other words, Let's pretend that I am part of the British East Indian Company. I'm British. I'm part of this company. I no longer, and I don't have to pay taxes on tea, but all you Americans that also sell tea, you do have to pay taxes. That makes my tea cheaper. Therefore, more people are going to buy my tea rather than yours. This